What's happening, folks? There were a few bits of news that were worth covering over the past few days, but none of them were really worth their own video. So I figured I'd just kind of do this quick Sunday night news dump. The first thing was in relation to some Switch 2 discounts that have been coming around, specifically over here in the States. The biggest one that people are seeing right now is the $400 Switch 2 over available at every Micro Center store. I believe it's in-store only. This is effectively the cheapest available price for the Nintendo Switch 2 if you're not interested in Mario Kart World. And technically, even if you are interested in Mario Kart World, the used market is pretty low for that game, so if you're buying a Switch at $400, the lowest MSRP in the United States right now, this is a good chance to get yourself a copy of a Switch 2 and Mario Kart World for probably just over $450. And then that way you actually have a physical copy of Mario Kart World that you own, if you wanted the game. But either way, at $400, that's officially the lowest priced available Switch 2. It's a deal that kind of came up out of nowhere for a console that we know for certain is not selling well. This is not anybody trying to be a loss leader. All of that should have been logical earlier this month when we saw the initial Switch 2 discounts, but people were just clinging on to this idea that the Switch 2 was doing so well that stores decided to drop their price in December. We now know that November was embarrassingly low, and now we're seeing clear signs that December is going to be just as bad. Now, the cool thing is, if you don't have a Micro Center nearby, there are reports that you're able to price match it. There are people reporting that they went to Best Buy, showed them the Micro Center price, and were able to buy a Switch 2 from there instead of driving whatever 45 minutes to an hour to their nearest Micro Center. Of course, I still don't think $400 for a Nintendo Switch 2 is necessarily a price that's worth it for me to jump in yet, but for others that were looking for a better deal and wanted to make sure they had a brand new console and were not interested in Mario Kart World, this could be very appealing for you. In addition to that, the Best Buy Mario Kart World bundle has actually gone down $50 like it was earlier this month, which is just once again more obvious news that the Switch 2 is not doing well this month of December, because we know that prices don't go down unless things are not selling well. And we know that all of those massive numbers of shipped units that were sent all around the world were clearly in preparation for this holiday season, and now they're going to be sitting on shelves. It'll be very interesting to see how that affects Nintendo's financials. I actually think they still hit that 19 million mark this year, just because between all of the markets around the world that they're shipping units to, as well as all of the untapped people that still want it in Japan, that 19 million should be very achievable since you're looking at ship numbers. But when it comes to the sold through numbers, that'll depend a lot on how many more of these deals and discounts that we'll see going throughout the year. It's important to track these sold units because that will determine how many more units get shipped out in the future. Because at some point in time, retailers will look and be like, this is selling way below our expectations, and I don't want to order anymore if we're just going to be sitting on it for months again. So the numbers should slow down, whether that's reflected in February or the quarterlies after that. But like I said, I think that 19 million is very likely. I don't anticipate Nintendo to adjust that forecast downwards, and depending on how many things were shipped out prior to the November holiday season, there's a good chance that 19 million might actually go up. But either way, we will keep track of what's being sold worldwide up until that point in time. I just know that when it comes to the United States, it's really not doing well this holiday season. There have been indications all throughout Europe that the Switch 2 is not doing well elsewhere, and I think people are kind of confused on this fact because they're seeing that the Switch 1 plus the Switch 2 sold 40% better than the Switch 1 did last year in the UK. I don't think we got Spain numbers yet. We know France is also looking a little bit concerning, but you have to understand that the Switch 1 did not do well in the UK last year. A 40% bump is not that impressive when it's a jump from the Switch 1 in its final year to a brand new Switch 2 in its first year. And keep in mind, even with this 40% bump, it's being outsold by the PlayStation 5 in many areas around Europe 3-1. Put it this way, the Switch 2 has already been struggling. It already is struggling in Europe. The only thing we learned from November is that in the US, it's also struggling just as bad as it is in Europe, which is something that I had already anticipated, but others didn't quite get it. If we had seen similar type of news in Europe, that it was performing like the US, and they were like, oh, it's also dropped down 10% fewer than the Switch 1 and the Switch 2 sold last year, that would have taken it from it's struggling in Europe to it's absolutely failing in Europe, because the bar in Europe was already so low going into November. As it stands, the Switch 2 is only doing well in Japan and really hasn't done well anywhere else since July. When it comes to hardware, when it comes to software, the August numbers and the September and the October numbers were only acceptable with the condition that November would be a massive bump. but November has not been a massive bump for the Switch 2, pretty much anywhere except for in Japan. So keep that in mind if you hear somebody say that the Switch 2 is selling very well in Europe but not in the States. There's a very clear reason as to why the prices started to drop in Europe back in October, and they're only just now starting to drop in the States. Put it that way. Now, that being said, I'm interested to see how this affects the Switch 2 sales numbers and prices starting from January and going into February, because this is going to be the slowest months out of the year. We could be seeing historic lows, both for the price of a brand new console as well as the amount of sales a new console manages. Moving on from there, the next bit of news that I wanted to cover was the Mario Kart World Bundle. As Nintendo had stated, the Mario Kart World Bundle would end in the fall. I think most people had expected that this thing would go until the start of the fall, but technically, tonight is the first night of winter, if I'm not mistaken. So they're still within that time limit. But until now, I am still of the opinion that the Mario Kart World Bundle was only supposed to last until the Pokemon Bundle came out in October. And given that the Mario Kart World Bundles were just not selling out, that led to stores ordering fewer Pokemon bundles because they're like, we don't want to sit on two different bundles. And I'm guessing that's a very big reason as to why we saw so many Pokemon bundles just sell out immediately and they never restocked. I think Target, if my previous estimates are correct, only had around 30,000 units. But either way, now we know officially that they are done with the production of the Mario Kart World bundles. And very specifically, I'm saying that they're done with the production of those bundles. Those bundles are still going to be for sale for quite a while, because we know that countries all around the world have gone out and ordered Switch 2s, and we know that a majority of the Switch 2s that they ordered were Mario Kart World, and we know that this majority of Switch 2s are not moving during this holiday season, which historically is roughly, 40 to 60% of the entirety of the sales numbers that a console usually does. So if the Switch 2 is having a slow holiday season, you're looking at least a couple million, if not more, Mario Kart World bundles out in the wild all over the world for a console that's moving that quickly. Basically, there's no need to rush and grab this thing out of fear of this end of production, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm never gonna get Mario Kart for a better price. Yeah, like I said, if you want a cheap version of Mario Kart World, go and buy the used copy. But I have a feeling that anybody that's listening to this is somebody that either already has Mario Kart World or was not planning on getting Mario Kart World anyway. So this news that the bundle is being ended is probably not going to make somebody that's already lasted this long without FOMO for the Switch 2 and Mario Kart World decide that they have to go to the store and buy it now. But I just wanted to shed some light on this discussion because I think many people heard that the bundle was ending and they thought that was like a big announcement because Nintendo was pulling back this amazing deal they had. But they told us this was going to happen. They told us it was going to be limited stock. If anything, it should have been ended a long time ago, but they just did not sell enough units to get through it quick enough. I do think this will be interesting to see what this does for Mario Kart World sales, but I actually don't think it'll make enough data for us to analyze properly. And the reason I say that is because Mario Kart World has already gotten such a boost from these Switch 2 units. Like, the game at this point is almost at a 90% attachment rate just from people buying the bundle. And the thing is, the Switch 2, I don't think it's going to be selling that well in the near future. So even if that attachment rate shrinks a little bit, it's still going to be a very high attachment rate. The only way we'll be able to tell how many people actually want to buy Mario Kart World at the $80 price tag that it has is if the Switch 2 suddenly manages to magically take off and start to live up to the hype that it had initially. Because then it'll have a large enough gap of new units that are purchased after the bundle ended where we can be like, okay, now the attachment rate has gone down from 8 out of every 10 people to maybe 6 or 7 out of every 10 people. But I just don't see it selling enough to the point where we can actually gauge the difference between those two things. This is, of course, unless we see some kind of massive price drop or some huge games that are announced to fix the narrative around the Switch 2 right now. But we will have to see how that goes. Because as it stands, there are fixes that are currently being made, which are clear indications that things are going bad for Nintendo. And the one that they're addressing the first is the one that was very important to them from the start of the console's launch life, the third-party sales. So there have been probably the most obvious indications of third parties massively struggling for the Nintendo Switch 2 all throughout the past few months. And I've covered this in depth in a plethora of videos. Nintendo is a device that people purchase for first-party games. The third parties exist, but they're very much an afterthought and they do not succeed to the extent on a Nintendo console as they would elsewhere, and I'm talking specifically about the big-name AAA titles that people put a lot of money into. With all of the hype of Cyberpunk, with all of the hype of Star Wars Outlaws, with every other third party that's come out on the Switch 2 so far, we saw Nintendo's give third parties the biggest push that they possibly could, even having Madden on their homepage of Nintendo.com for a while, trying to push Star Wars Outlaws as the biggest title to be launched in 2025, it seems, based off of how many YouTubers were pushing that game. And Nintendo held off on releasing any major first-party game for most of the summer because they were trying to give third parties a chance to flourish. But still, we saw in the financial reports that the software sales were overwhelmingly first party, and that was just basically mostly a bundled Mario Kart and a Donkey Kong Bonanza that had like a 20% attachment rate. It was really not looking good for third parties, and every few months it felt like we were getting another news story about a third party complaining about something related to the Nintendo Switch 2. I think many people were in denial because they were looking at eShop lists. Many people were in denial because they were looking at Amazon bestsellers, primarily on the day that something is announced, where the algorithm will push it higher on the bestseller list because it weights more recent sales more favorably than they do sales from a few weeks ago. But either way, there was all of this like false information that the Switch 2 would become the next third-party giant, and so far we have not seen that come into fruition. And I think one of the most obvious proofs that third parties are not doing well on the Nintendo Switch 2 is Nintendo is completely backpedaling on the game keycard situation. If third parties were doing well on the Nintendo Switch 2, there is no chance in hell that Nintendo would be suddenly providing smaller sized cartridges for third-party developers. So in case you guys didn't get the news, one of these third-party devs said that they were going to be releasing their game fully on cartridge because Nintendo is offering smaller sizes. And then very quickly after that, they tweeted and they're like, actually, this is not official from Nintendo. We're just going to tell you this is fully on cart. I'm guessing that Nintendo came and told them that they had to be quiet and take back that statement, because obviously Nintendo can't have the people out there knowing that they're listening to them complain. And it makes them look weak, which makes their shareholders lose confidence in them if it seems like they're backpedaling on anything. So they didn't want the third-party developer to go out there and say that they were adding more cartridge sizes, and effectively giving third-party devs a chance to move away from game keycards without having to pay for the full 64GB cartridge. Now, just to clarify a few things, I don't think this is going to solve the third-party issue on the Nintendo console. I've said this from the very beginning. Game keycards are disgusting, they're disturbing, they suck, they should not be in this industry, especially on a Nintendo console, because Nintendo is the worst when it comes to control of your device and your lack of ownership. But it's not going to make the Nintendo Switch 2 the third-party console of choice, because there are so many better ways to play third-party games than playing them on a Nintendo console. In fact, the Nintendo console is objectively probably the worst device to play any third-party game on, specifically when it comes to AAA things. And since we live in a society where most people own more than one device to play games on, either a stronger PC or the competition which is stronger, that being Xbox or PlayStation, especially outside of Japan, this is not going to suddenly solve the issue. Game keycards were part of the problem. They were not the majority of the problem. The majority of the problem is that people buy Nintendo consoles for Nintendo games, not for third-party games, especially the massive AAA third-party ones. This is my prediction, of course, but I don't know. I'm feeling confident. I got a chip on my shoulder because I've been right about so much recently. As per usual, I could be wrong, but I don't know what to tell you. Everybody has always said, I buy Nintendo for the Nintendo games, and I fully agree with that. And those of you that do not buy Nintendo for the first-party Nintendo titles are probably the exception. Just look at the sales numbers for Nintendo titles. Actually, I didn't really do a full Circana breakdown because there was so much more to talk about when it comes to the software sales. But just as expected, the first month where there's so many more first-party titles available, and also the month where the most Switch 2s have been sold since July, the Circana chart shows mostly first-party games. The third-party games are nowhere to be seen anymore. And this is only going to continue because as more first-party games are released, those are always going to be the ones that sell the best. Even if a first-party title is not selling well, it's going to sell better than third-party titles on a Nintendo console. That's just the reality, game keycard or otherwise. But another thing I thought was very interesting was that these smaller cartridges are still going to cause Switch 2 games to go up in price. Because this third-party developer said that we now have smaller cartridges we can use without having to spend the money on the 64GB cartridge, and their game is going up $10 still. That is actually insane. The Switch 2, Nintendo, is single-handedly causing games to go up in price. Because here's what happens. A third-party dev is going to be like, okay, I want to put this game out on the Switch 2, the Xbox, and the PlayStation. And they're going to realize in order to get a truly physical game on the Nintendo Switch 2, they can't use a game keycard. They gotta put it on a cartridge because they want people to be more likely to buy it. So even with the smaller cartridges, they're adding $10 to that price. I don't even want to know how much more they were paying for the 64GB cartridge. Maybe that $16 number was underselling it. I guess that's why Cyberpunk was at $70. But I don't know, I figured the smaller cartridges might give it like a $5 or $6 bump, not a $10 bump, but still, so they're going to come to the Switch 2 and they're going to be like, well, we want it fully on cartridge, which means we're going to have to pay the extra 10, 15, or 20 bucks, but we can't charge the Nintendo guys the higher price right at launch, not immediately anyway. So that additional cost we're paying to put it on the Nintendo store will match that same price on PlayStation and Xbox, and even Steam if we need to. So now, because they want to get their games on the Switch 2, it's going to make their games more expensive for everybody. Although in fairness, when the discounts come around, they'll be probably cheaper on Steam, cheaper on Sony, cheaper on Xbox. This is pretty common actually already, and the Nintendo fandom will likely get the worst discount. But that starting price now is going to be a lot easier to normalize because of these cartridges, and obviously also because Nintendo shoved an $80 price tag down everybody's throat this year, making all of these devs look like they're the good guys for only charging 70 bucks for their games now. But yeah, those are 3 pretty decent bits of news that I thought were worth covering, and they're 3 pretty good discussions for us to keep our eyes on. How much will these discounts help the Switch 2? Why are these discounts happening? Obviously because it's not selling well, primarily because it's overpriced. And most importantly, how much lower will the price of the Switch 2 go, either from Nintendo or through these retailer discounts? It'll be a very fun thing to track in the early months of 2026. And then obviously, in addition to that, will be the Mario Kart sales. Let's see how long the bundle lasts, number 1, because now we know they're done production of that. And number 2, also if this slows down the sales of Mario Kart World. Because as it stands, the Mario Kart World sales are still going to be tied to the bundle until that's out of stock. I just don't think it's going to be out of stock anytime soon. And finally, the situation with the game key cards. Is this going to cause third-party games to go up in price a little bit? And will it actually lead to any relevant sales? I think it might give third parties a little bit of a bump, but not enough to make the Switch 2 the third-party console of choice. But it won't even be close to that, in my opinion. We'll see. That's all I got for right now. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good holiday. I will be back probably tomorrow, maybe the next day. I will catch you on the next one.